Welcome to True North Project. This is Christian. And if you're one of the 3 regular listeners, welcome back. This is my first episode as a officially married man, I suppose. And, well, I shouldn't suppose. I in fact am a married man, and got the ring to prove it. Just got back from the Eclipse Festival. Not just, but a few weeks ago. I've been kind of fell off the bandwagon with the regular releasing and regular posting. Had a bit of a surreal and epic experience. Then got kind of caught up and got under the weather a little bit. So kind of fell off the wagon of weekly posting of this podcast. So this isn't my, I've kind of been rethinking it a little bit because it does take up quite a bit of energy, and I've got a lot of things that I'm plates that I'm spinning, and I kind of have space right now for about 1 post of something per week, I believe, if I manage my time correctly. And I just launched a Substack a little while ago, and I just released a post there, and it ended up taking quite a bit more time. It was a bit more of a rabbit hole than I expected as far as writing that blog post, kind of about my Mormon story, my backstory, if you will, growing up in a fundamentalist Mormon cult. So that was I actually enjoyed writing that more than I thought I would. And it's part 1 of a 6-part series. So what I'm trying to say is I'm going to be putting more energy into writing and into Substack, and actually thinking about moving this podcast over to Substack as well. It'll still be hosted, wherever you're listening, through Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever. But Substack's like the last cool social network, seems like. Hasn't been tainted and ruined by all of the race to the bottom dynamics that have kind of fucked Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and everything else. So Substack's a really groovy place with mostly just good content as far as I can tell. And it's not spammy. So it's been growing on me more and more. And so I think I'm going to host this podcast through Substack. And I think it's just a better way to connect with your audience as well. So I'm going to use that as sort of an opportunity to transition and try to take a beginner's mind into how I approach this podcast, and just True North Project in general. I think I'm going through as I'm transitioning into married life and focusing more on family and starting a family and that kind of thing. It's like really inviting me to rethink my relationship to this project and how how it fits into my life and how I want to show up for it. So really, this is like just my creative outlet and a way for me to follow my curiosity and just create authentically and hopefully orient towards beauty. So I'm going to try to approach that with a beginner's mind. These episodes might change a bit, and I might do more solo stuff, and hopefully just get more guests on as well, like just the guests that I want to talk to. And Forrest Landry is definitely one of those people. This episode with Forrest is his 3rd appearance on this podcast. Unfortunately, we didn't get as much time to dive in deeper as much as I'd like to, because he was traveling and time constraint, and also kind of took this call on his phone. So he ran out of battery towards, the conversation ended rather abruptly because his phone died. So it wasn't as high fidelity as I would have liked or as long as I would have liked. And we didn't get a chance to go as deep into a dialogue as I would have liked to. So there's a lot more to talk about with Forrest. But I'm super grateful that he carved out some time for this conversation. And we dive into this really sort of holy trinity of conscious, sustainable evolution, which you might say is sort of a North Star for humanity or our species, that we could be shooting for, orienting to, is how do we become consciously how do we evolve consciously and sustainably as a species? So that was sort of the nature of the conversation. And Forrest was just riffing, and he went into a magical riff, as he tends to do, and I just let him go. So you might need to, rewind and re-listen to some things. He's got a lot of juice there. But if you really want the most approachable and impactful sort of pound for pound content, if we can call it that, that Forrest has put out, I really recommend checking out his book, The Effective Choice. It's been my one of my go-to sort of tomes of wisdom. Keep it on the coffee table, along with The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. You got Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. These are the kind of flavor of books that I'm talking about, that I just love to have around. And The Effective Choice is definitely one of those. I've had myself going back to it all the time. So we've got a bunch of copies of it. If you're in St. George, Utah, and you can stop by True North, you can get them for super cheap there. And I'll drop a link in the show notes for Forrest's link to The Effective Choice if you want to check it out. But yeah, expect some different stuff, hopefully, coming through this project. And I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but really curious and excited to see where it goes. Definitely more writing. And so if you're curious about that, all the links to all my things are at truenorthproject.com, including the Substack link. So if you didn't know that was happening and you're curious, you want to check out what I'm writing, what I'm putting out there, check out True North on Substack, and Substack in general. There's some really great writers and creators on there. And if you want like a way less spammy way to get access to creators and to information, I think Substack's a great platform still. Hopefully it doesn't devolve like the rest of them did. Okay, so with that, I will roll this conversation with Forrest Landry. Much love.
Great.
All right, man. Well, it's good to see you again, and always love the opportunity to talk to you. So thank you for carving out some time on your journey to the celestial meeting of sun and moon.
Earth, moon, and sun. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, it's funny. I heard you were going to the eclipse. I'm like, I wonder if he's going to the same festival I am, and I'd love to just meet up with you in person and do this conversation in person. We're going to be in there's apparently a big festival happening right outside of Austin, so that's going to be where I'm at. And I will be, while you're looking at it eclipse, I will be getting married. So that's also something that, sorry, go ahead.
I said congratulations. That's an amazing confluence you're connecting to. So that's going to be quite a phenomenon to live up to in a marriage. Awesome.
Yeah, we'll see how that living up part plays out, but very excited about the union of both the sun and moon and the metaphorical sun and moon of me and my partner. It's very, very, very exciting.
You'll have to start planning your reunion vows, like the 50-year anniversary a long time in advance.
Well, there's another total eclipse happening over Portugal in 2026 in the summer. And we were thinking about planning on going to that, and then we'll just chase the eclipse every couple of years and just renew our union, and just like make it an excuse to go have a good time. Yeah. Well, this idea of the union and the marriage and this sort of transition in my life, because this is a big phase shift for me and a new chapter and a death process of letting go of an old chapter. Planning on stepping into fatherhood shortly after, if that works out. And the reason I bring that up is to kind of frame this conversation of what does conscious, sustainable evolution look like, and to ground it into the tangible, practical for me in particular, which is, like if I'm going to make this take this plunge into fatherhood, parenthood, we're fully locked in and betting on the future. We're 100% invested in the future. I mean, if we weren't already as humans on Earth, now we're really, really invested in the future of Earth. So, um, it sounds kind of silly to say as if you couldn't be invested, but it seems like the stakes become higher. And so I want to orient to the more beautiful world, as Eisenstein puts it. I want to orient to a more protopian future, not one where where the children are begging for water, for clean water, or where AI or some other apocalypse scenarios happened and it's really just uninhabitable Earth. So that's where my mind and my heart's been at.
Hmm.
And you have a couple of really valuable frames and you've thought really deeply about the future and about a sustainable evolution. And so that's kind of the conversation that I'm interested in having is how do we orient towards conscious sustainable evolution? And then from there, from that question, just to kind of frame it up a little bit more, um, how does, vision, strategy, and culture fit in? And how do we do that in the right order and in the right way? Right. And then ultimately balancing man, machine, and nature. So there's those three triples that are all sort of like woven together. And I'll just like, if there's anything else, you want to add to that or just take it away.
I think I can start with that. So, um, to contextualize this a little bit, the notion of conscious sustainable evolution is essentially a kind of way of orienting towards an outcome. So, for instance, in the work that I've been doing, I've been thinking a lot about existential risk, which is a very short term sort of thing. Like that might affect humanity in maybe a dozen years or at most 100 years. Whereas when we're looking at civilization design, we're looking at things that would basically be, maybe between 50 and 100 years out in terms of how we think about it, or even a few hundred years out, maybe 500 years out. But if we're looking at what are we really wanting to orient to in terms of how we even think about what does it mean to make good civilization? What is good civilization design grounded with respect to? Like, how do we even understand what is a healthy world? And so the notion of conscious sustainable evolution is essentially the farthest reaching into the future. And it's essentially a way of saying, here is a place where we have clarity about what does it mean to have a healthy world. So the way to think about this a little bit is to say, if I was basically trying to design something, but I don't know what it is that makes good design, maybe I look at something which is well designed and I reverse engineer that a little bit. So if I look at what is a healthy long-term future 1500 years from now, and what are the characteristics that that has, can I characterize that in a clear enough, fundamental enough way that I could use that as a way of orienting present tense choices with respect to things like, how I might orient a particular business or how I might orient a community, or what does it mean to be a healthy community in the first place. And so, in effect, the notion of conscious sustainable evolution is a reference with which we understand what do we mean when we say the world we all want to be a part of or the world we want to live in. So, in other words, it takes Charles Eisenstein's sort of heartfelt sort of desire and direction that is essentially an orienting, and it kind of provides a north star to act as a calibration for how we hold the world we want to live in the present. So as a north star, of course, is really far away, right? I mean, it's like it's beyond the world. It's essentially way out there in space, and therefore it makes a good orienting point because it's relevant anywhere on the surface that you can see the north star. So northern hemisphere, basically. And in this particular sense, conscious sustainable evolution is an orienting principle. So it's abstract in that sense, but we want to show a little bit about why we would select that as essentially the ordinating basis, and then how does that translate into thinking about things like the balance between humanity, technology, and nature, which is super important to making it so that conscious sustainable evolution happens. and how we go even more to the immediate of thinking about culture, vision, and strategy as a way of basically making it so that we have the outcome of a balance between humanity, technology, and nature. And through that, we have the outcome of conscious, sustainable evolution. So, in effect, you can think of these triples as being different degrees of abstraction away from the here and now that they align to orient the here and now with respect to the future we all want to be a part of.
Yeah,
So,
that's beautiful.
yeah. So why conscious sustainable evolution? Why would I pick that? And so in effect, remember, we're talking at this level of really long term. I don't necessarily know um, a lot about what the future is going to bring, but I can say something about what sort of forces are going to operate. And insofar as the very flow of time itself essentially implies change, then in effect, I can look at what are the ways in which we can adapt to change in a sustainable way, right? Because if we don't have sustainability, then the continuance of consciousness, the continuance of things that we already know that we value, such as life and basically the kinds of things that we enjoy as good experiences in community or in relationships. You're talking about developing a family, and to some extent, there is the desire to develop a family is a recognition that there's a kind of goodness in that process. And so in this sense, we're looking at, okay, we know that sustainability is important to preserve the goodness, and we know that change happens. And the way in which we create a capacity to adapt to that change is kind of an evolutionary dynamic. So you can think of sustainability as essentially creating changelessness in the context of change. And you can think of evolution as essentially creating more change so that adaptation is happening. So you can think of sustainability as like the perfection of changelessness, and evolution as the perfection of mutability, the perfection of change taken to its maximum extent. And so in effect, we want the right level of the balance between change and changelessness, because if we have too much change, then we don't have sustainability. And if we have too much sustainability, then everything is the same, never changes, it's perfectly static. And that which is perfectly static is effectively equivalent to death. So if we value life, we have to, in a sense, integrate the right rate of change, because life can adapt to change at a certain rate and it can sustain itself at a certain rate. And we want to balance those two factors. So on what basis do we balance perfected change with perfected changelessness? How do we balance perfected evolution with perfected sustainability? And this is basically like a great philosopher's question, because in effect it allows us to, or it requires us to essentially get down to essentially like what are the root principles. And we notice that any balance between perfected change and perfected changelessness can't presuppose one or the other as a basis, because that would be biasing the outcome of the balance, biasing the outcome of the choice between when we want more change, when we want more changelessness. So what do we mean by when we want? Like, how does that get figured out? And it turns out that any algorithm that we would use to try to figure that out, any procedure, any methodology that we could define in advance to try to balance change and changelessness would itself partake of either change or changelessness. And an algorithm, because it's a fixed pattern of procedure, is effectively unchanging. So in effect, if I used an algorithm, I would be regulating the relationship between change and changelessness, assuming a basis of an unchanging algorithm. And so in this sense, we know that that's not a true balancing between change and changelessness, because eventually there will emerge something for which that algorithm is not adapted, for which that algorithm can't create a balance, and the algorithm fails. So therefore, no algorithm no matter how we conceive of it, will basically be so perfect that it could account for all possible unknown, unknowable change. And so in effect, what happens is that we say, okay, what is a principle by which we can create this balance between change and changelessness that is more potent or more effective at dealing with the intrinsics of this balance than any algorithm could possibly be? Well, one of the things we notice is that choice making, consciousness, conscientiousness is going to dynamically be the balance between change and changelessness because it partakes of both naturally. Consciousness is a kind of coherency phenomenon, and in that sense, it has a kind of stasis or sustainability built into it. But it's also very adaptive. If you don't have a continual flow of perceptions and expressions, then consciousness is not. So in this sense, there's a sense in which consciousness is already a balancing between change and changelessness. It's already a keeping of that. And it's not done in an algorithmic way. It's done in a way that transcends the notion of algorithm. Like, you can't encode consciousness in an algorithm. You can encode intelligence in an algorithm. But I don't know any artificial intelligence researchers that will claim that making an intelligent system is making a conscious one. Most people don't know what consciousness is, and people who are working in technology aren't more likely to know that than anybody else. And so as a result, we have this sort of recognition that in the depths of making good choices in the space of when to take on more evolution or when to take on more sustainability, that we need a dynamic process that in a sense is going to be live to the situation within the context itself and can't be presupposed by any advanced process. So in other words, I'm not going to be able to define the balance between change and changelessness before the need for that balance occurs. So in this sense, that's why consciousness, conscious, sustainable evolution. I want to have evolution, adaptiveness occurring in a sustainable way as governed by consciousness. And so that's why the triple. And it turns out that there's deeper reasons even than what I've just mentioned. But those deeper reasons go well outside of the scope of this. But why there are triples and what the balances are between the triples, there's a field of view which can be thought of as a sort of like meta-conceptual way of thinking, or in the relationship between the subjective and the objective directly, that shows certain patterns that effectively can therefore be recognized and understood as to why we can know for sure that conscious sustainable evolution is the characterization of the long future that is the most accurate, the most precise way of speaking to how do we balance humanity, technology, and nature, and how do we balance the requirements of culture, vision, and strategy, because those things are places where we need coherence in order for social process to actually work. Right? If I have a group of people, but half of them has one strategy and another has the other strategy, you actually have two groups. If you have a group of people and half of them have one culture and half of them have another culture, it's two groups. So in order for us to really recognize the way in which we implement conscious sustainable evolution, we need to know how to implement the balance between humanity, technology, and nature. We need to know how to do the balance between culture, technology, and nature. And so in effect, we can see that in a certain sense that these triples line up a particular way. And I haven't named the alignments yet, but I'm just going to point out as a kind of foreshadowing that in order for us to create conscious sustainable evolution, that we need to get the sequencing right in the nature, humanity, technology triangle. And so in effect, it's kind of like if I look at it at the sort of outcome level, I notice that consciousness is acting as a kind of balancing between this notion of evolution, say on my left hand, and this notion of sustainability on my right hand. But in another sense, you notice I always say it as conscious sustainable evolution, right? There's a sequencing going on there, that evolution to some extent is a process that gave rise to consciousness, but consciousness is a process that gives rise to sustainability, and sustainability is needed to give rise to the process of evolution. Like, if I don't have it in that specific sequence, then things just don't work. right? There's a sense in which life itself is upheld by the right sort of flow, right? Evolution that occurred sporadically in some places and not in others mostly just doesn't work. So in effect, it has to presuppose a kind of continuity of process. And the continuity of process that we call sustainability is, to some extent, if you're dealing with conscious beings in a world that effectively are making choices that are needing to favor some amount of sustainability rather than just evolution, then in effect there's a sense in which consciousness is the basis by which we can balance these things, and in effect that's now presupposing that. But where did consciousness come from? Well, there's a lot of people who think about the world in terms of epiphenomenalism. I personally disagree with that, but the point here is that to some extent we have to have an evolving process in order for consciousness to even occur. And so in this sense, we notice, for example, that in the same sense that nature gives rise to humanity, right? That nature is a kind of unconscious process. I'm talking about all the trees and plants and animals all taken together. Evolution taken together gives rise to self-reflective, to some extent these days egoic human beings, conscious human beings, finite beings that are now in a place where they're making choices, right? Nature, for the most part, evolution doesn't really make choices the way that we think about making choices. And so in effect, there's a sense in which we are mediating a relationship between unconscious technology and unconscious nature. And if we make these choices poorly, then we end up with technology dominating nature and nature dying, or humanity in wrong relationship to nature and nature dying, at which point the support system for humanity goes away, and then there's no support system for the technology goes away. Whereas on the other hand, if we made it that the technology was self-supporting, then what ends up happening is that the technology will effectively be compelled to make choices to favor its own self, its own production, at which point we end up with substrate needs argument issues or instrumental convergence issues, and technology takes over the world, life dies, humanity dies. So in this sense, it becomes crucially important for humanity to remain in the space of conscious choices with respect to technology and nature in order to uphold the continuance of sustainability and evolution for humanity's sake, even if nothing else, right? So in this sense, there's a notion here that, well, how do we do that? Like, what is the way in which we make the kinds of choices that need to be made in order to address the existential risk created by technology? Well, in this particular space, we know that consciousness is a coherence phenomenon. We know that choice is a cooperative process. So in this particular sense, we need to get as skillful at making choices individually and collectively as we have already developed skillfulness in the nature of managing causation. And prior to that, in, say, ancient times, well before recorded history, that humanity had to be able to navigate the space of living in the context of nature, living in the context of change. Right? Mastery in the old world was basically living in the context of flow, living in the dynamic of change. But then we learned how to do causation, which meant we stepped away from change, we separated ourselves from nature, and now we operate on nature with causal process. All of scientific knowledge and all of technology is essentially an application of causal knowledge. So science is learning about causation and technology is applying it. And that is the totality of what science and technology actually is. So in this sense, we can notice that no matter how skillful you may be in living in the context of change, it doesn't necessarily teach you anything about causation. You have to decide to learn that. And in the same sort of way that having mastery of causation, which a lot of the world does, I mean, that's what the modern world is essentially a kind of exemplar of the mastery of causation. That doesn't teach you anything about the nature of choice. To learn about the nature of making good choices, you need to go beyond technology. You need to go beyond causation. And so in this particular sense, there's this underlying triple of choice, change, and causation, which is essentially the connection that holds some of these other triples together. It's like this deeper ordinate basis. And we know that reality is that which is at once choice, change, and causation. Anything that doesn't partake of all three of these is an illusion. It's not real. And I'll say that we should distinguish between existence and objectivity, but that's a separate conversation, which would probably be more of interest to philosophers. But the point is that somewhere along the way, we notice that technology can give us lots and lots of options of what we can choose, but it doesn't tell us what we should choose, what we ought to choose, what is good or right to choose, what is healthy or wholesome or sustaining to choose. So if we're going to achieve conscious sustainable evolution as an outcome, we need to know what a good choice is. And the whole idea of conscious sustainable evolution is to give us a reference so that we can distinguish what is a good choice from what is not a good choice, individually and collectively. And that brings it into the present moment for us directly. So in this particular sense, we're now concerned with what are the dynamics by which we make good choices. And we notice that to do that, we need not just consciousness in order to have a basis of choice at all, but essentially to understand what is health, what is essentially the right basis of care, and how do we even hold care. And that is, again, an individual and a collective phenomenon. So now we need to think about, how do I hold culture as a way of just being the thing that is essentially the ground truth by which these values are going to be referenced. And then how does that connect back to vision, which is essentially a statement of values, a sort of story of what it is that we value, what is the basis of choice that we're going to be operating on the thing of. And then once we know what we value, what it is we care about, how do we translate those values into actionable things that we're going to do? And again, there's a cooperative element, because we need to, in a sense, to some extent, not just collaborate to figure out what our values are and how this can be translated into tactics and strategy, but also that to a large extent, we're looking at, what is the thing that we can do that is the resources that'll essentially navigate us on this critical path that does actually balance humanity, technology, and nature. Because if we don't do that, we lose the sustainability, we lose the evolution, we lose the basis of life and of care itself. So in effect, we're now looking at this notion of how do we make good choices individually and collectively in a way that sustains a kind of, it's an evolutionary choice dynamic that is creating of sustainability of community, of the relationship between humanity, technology, and nature itself. So in this particular sense, we then start to distill down to, even more present tense kind of things, like what does it mean to be a healthy culture? What does it mean to have, a good vision or a good strategy? Or what does it mean to have good visions and good strategy as like individual items? Like how do we get to the place where we know that? Well, at this point, we're now looking at the sort of dynamics of what community is, who we are as a species, as a collection of human beings at whatever scale. In what way do we make choices that are actually good for the well-being of ourselves in the context of the world, using technology as a methodology, but not limited by that? Because again, it's going to be, what is the North Star that we're in a sense guiding our choices by, and how do we hold that in the present? And so in this particular sense, by noticing that, again, all of these things are sequenced. I said culture first, then vision, then strategy. But if I look in the modern world, I look at, say, businesses. All businesses basically start as a strategy to use vision to manipulate culture. It's actually backwards. And so in effect, what happens is that there's an ordination that creates a sort of command and control structure that is fundamentally destructive of life, because it's in the wrong sequence. It starts from singular and tries to affect global. A person strategy, I want to make money, so I'm going to find a vision of a product or a service that people are really invested in or want, and then I'm going to basically make it that I'm the provider of that, directly or indirectly, or my company is. I'm going to get people invested in the vision of we can be the provider of that. I get venture capital, I hire an executive team, I basically convince the executive team that the vision is good, so my strategy is good, and then they basically form a culture that becomes a culture of using the strategy and this vision to hire a bunch of staff to build the product, to convince the world that this is a thing, and then the world starts buying it, and people are making money, and kumbaya. But that's not actually kumbaya, because it's too singular. It started from a very myopic perspective that is just looking at one dimension, a notion of profit. but the world is actually complex. And, to understand the implications of planting a single tree in a place is going to have environmental consequences 100 years from now. So in effect, we're really looking at on what basis do we make good choices. It's certainly not going to come from a single point of view. We're in a sense going to need a collection of perspectives in order to have enough insight, because insight only emerges from the combination of multiple perspectives, right? We have two eyeballs to take two-dimensional fields and to combine them with the nervous tissue of the brain to create a third dimension perspective. I can have insight, I can see into things, can tell how far away something is by the synthesis of perspectives. So I want the most diverse perspectives, and I want the best synthesis process to get the best insights as to how to support not only to notice what we care about and to be clear about what that care is, but how to actually support that care in the actions that we take. So in this particular sense, choice is an expressive process based upon insight into care. So where does that come from? Well, we need culture in order to really recognize what it is that actually matters, because it's only through the diversity of that process and the synthesis of what that culture is being held that we can actually gain enough insight into what actually matters, what is the true basis of choice. And that wants to be held in a distributed way in both the vision and the values. And since it's ultimately cooperation between human beings that achieves anything anyways, then in effect, we're now looking at the implementation of upholding those values or those things in culture in a strategy that is itself a cooperative process. So rather than starting single person strategy, single person's vision, and single person's outcome of culture, we're now looking at culture in a distributed way, vision in a distributed way, values in a distributed way, and therefore strategy in a distributed way, implementation in a distributed way. And so in effect, we undo the extraction, abstraction, accumulation dynamic, which is essentially part of the reason why the world is coming apart, and we replace it with a distribution, embodiment, contextualization dynamic. And that, in effect, heals the balance between technology and nature. Because, in effect, if you just do extraction, abstraction, accumulation, you lose the information that you need to make good choices to uphold the well-being of the fabric of life. So, in effect, we're looking at a situation where humans believe that nature is supporting humans, which it is, but they're treating it too exclusively. They're not quite in right relationship. They're degrading nature. But then they believe that machinery is in service to humanity. And that, of course, turns out not to be the case. And the only real way to proceed to uphold nature is essentially to use the technological capacities to make nature more healthy so that humanity can be more healthy, so that the right use of technology can actually be decided and actually balance that triangle of humanity, technology, and nature actually. Because if nature goes away, we're done. If humanity goes away, we're done. If technology goes away, we're actually also kind of done, because humanity right now can't really live without the technology. So if we're going to restabilize this in a way that evolution has basically been the guide basis of human choice making up to roughly recently, like the last few hundred years, and particularly the last 50 years, and more even particularly the last 5 years, we've gotten so deep into the code of how human beings work that we're destabilizing our own basis. Social media is basically degrading culture and social process everywhere. And technology is degrading natural process everywhere because we're unconscious, because we have this expectation that the evolutionary dynamics that have been built into our bodies over the last billion years or so have given us all the information we need to handle technology that's only appeared on the scene in the last 5,000 years. So evolution isn't moving fast enough to have given us the unconscious competence to deal with the balance of technology and nature. We have to use consciousness to essentially address that, which is the first time humanity's ever been possessed, or even this world, so far as we know, has ever been presented with a dilemma of this kind. What got us here won't get us there. So we need to become conscious of our choices in a way that humanity has never had to before. And this is the dilemma of our time. This is the meta crisis and the meta crisis, and all the dimensions of it is we need to become skillful, consciously making choices, knowing what the values are, and implementing those in a way that actually is a balance in all of the senses among all of the triples that we've been talking about so far. And nothing less will be good enough. So in this particular sense, the no matter how perfect your use of technology, there will always be things where somewhere along the way you're going to have to make choices. And if you don't know how to make those choices, you won't make good choices. And if you rely on unconscious instinct to do that, you won't have enough intuition or insight or intelligence to actually do so. So that notion of conscious sustainable evolution is not just words. It's essentially the key that basically describes what needs to happen. And right now, evolution is sort of already occurring and sustainability is sort of already occurring, but it's mostly occurring because of unconscious processes. But if we want it to continue to occur, consciousness must come into balance. And while technology is really good at supporting, transactional process and particularly power, it's not so good at supporting care. So as human beings, we need to get much, much better at being aware of what we care about and embodying care in terms of our relationships and our practices in how we do all the things. And this is where we start getting down to brass tacks, right? Because basically what it's requiring then is for us to be nuanced and aware of things like, am I in a care-based relationship? Am I in a transactional relationship? Am I in a power-based relationship? And you were saying at the beginning of this call that you're getting married. If the marriage ends up devolving into a transactional process or a power-based relationship, it ain't going to be happy. It ain't going to be a good marriage. A good marriage is one where people care for each other. And although there may be transactional aspects occasionally, and there may be power aspects occasionally, that ultimately the basis of the relationship is the care that we have for one another as human beings, as part of the life cycle, right? If you intend to have children, which I've heard that you have, congratulations, then in effect, the thing that makes the humanity work is the care for the child. You don't care for the child, child's going to die. So in effect, there's a sense in which ultimately human relationships are care-based at the beginning of life and at the end of life. And they're only slightly transactional and power-based in the midterm, in the middle years of life, between, say, 16 and 60. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which we genuinely need to embrace the skill of holding care, to become conscious of how we hold care, individually and collectively, or we won't survive the Fermi paradox crisis this planet is currently enduring. And so that's how all these pieces fit together.
Well then, well said. I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job of holding all that, but I want to circle back. There's a few, there's like 5 threads, but I want to circle back and do a couple things. First, I just want to bracket this idea of the geometry of the triple, and we can come back to it later, but I am curious to go further into that conversation around why these triples matter. And I've been feeling this same sort of, like, I don't know if you'd call it the symmetry of it, or is either symmetry or continuity. It's one of those.
Both.
Both.
So symmetry and continuity are themselves part of a triple. The idea of these things being triples are themselves, like, we want to do what's necessary and sufficient and comprehensive, right? Because just doing a few of the necessary things isn't good enough. You need to know that you're doing all of the necessary things. Is the collection of necessary things sufficient to the need? And is it actually a comprehensive? Is it like, sufficiency would basically imply a kind of minimum, whereas comprehensiveness is implying, like, no, it covers everything that is needed to be covered, not just the bare minimums that sufficiency or necessity would imply. So even the notion of necessity, sufficiency, and comprehensiveness is a triple. And it turns out that you're looking at triples all the way down, like in every single aspect. And so in effect, once you get to a place where you can see the underlying topology, the underlying flow, the underlying nature of nature itself, then in effect, it becomes possible to recognize these triples as being a necessary and sufficient and comprehensive way of describing some of these really super hard questions. So there is a kind of continuity and symmetry built into it. And between the principles of those, we get to sort of have confidence that we're on the right track, that we know what we're doing, that we have a real sense that this will actually work, and we know why it will work. Like, we're not just saying, hey, I have an answer. We're saying, am I asking the right questions? And how do I know that I'm asking the right questions? And moreover than that, how do I know that I'm asking the right questions? And there's a kind of closure on that recursion that basically allows us to get to a place of true confidence that these things are not just arbitrary, but actually like fundamental to the nature of the relationship between, guess what? Truth, beauty, and goodness,
Hmm.
right? Because in a certain sense, we're basically saying, if we're going to get to the goodness, we need to know something about truth. And to get to that, we need to know something about what is the basis by which we even recognize truth? What is elegance in this case? And elegance isn't just, hey, it's a simple thing. No, it's profoundly clear. And profoundly means it has insight that crosses through multiple layers of these domains, multiple layers of these triples. And we keep seeing the same phenomena over and over and over again, a kind of recurrence that allows us to know that we're on the right track in more than just a trivial way. And that's the difference.
Yeah. So I guess we're not bracketing it. We're talking about it now. So like the feeling or the intuition I have is that there's this sort of holy trinity underpinning all of it. Like it's
Yeah,
the same form that's being sort of expressed many, many different times through these different domains or ways of knowing it, ways of interfacing with it. And so conscious sustainable evolution, man, machine, nature, all these different ways of sort of filtering it or expressing it, but we're really pointing to sort of a profoundly deep underlying structure.
that's right.
Um,
That's the metaphysics itself. And so in effect, what happens is that there's now a series of sort of guideposts that we can navigate the space of these really hard questions with confidence. And so in effect, in one sense, I can answer the questions using individual triples, and I can kind of point to why the cycle shows up this way in each one, or why it's a triple rather than 4 or 10 or 15 or something, right? That there's a sense in which there's a coherency to this underlying pattern. The underlying pattern is, on one hand, so hyper abstract that it's basically like it's very difficult to hold. In another sense, it's so concrete because it touches the very nature of the relationship between doing, being, and becoming itself, or between um, existence, creation, and interaction, which are like universal concepts. And we're noticing these recurrences of these ideas at so many levels that effectively it becomes a body of knowledge onto itself that coordinates all other bodies of knowledge. In fact, even the nature of what is being, ontology, knowing, how do we know anything at all, and value in the sense of care is sort of like axiology in a sense, right? We're basically saying that even the relationship between the subjective and the objective is held with these concepts as intrinsics, and that these are all different lenses by which we can perceive something as profound as the meta crisis with real intelligence. And we know, moreover than that, as you just mentioned, that it's not just that our intuition is getting affirmed, our instincts are getting affirmed, our intelligence is getting affirmed. In fact, we will know that it's a good choice, that we're making a good choice, when I can have it feel supported both in the instinct and intuition sense and in the intellectual sense at the same time. Right? There's no contradiction between those three views. They work differently, right? The epistemology of intellect and the epistemology of instinct and the epistemology of intuition are just different, but they are co-supporting. They are co-entangled with one another. They are distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable. And those who have studied with me would recognize that language as being a specific form. And so, in effect, there's a sense here by deepening our capacity to think, our capacity to feel, our capacity to deal with and process emotions, that we will be more effective as human beings making choices. That by being fully in our true embodiment, that we will become the solution.
yeah, I've been rapping about this myself. This was something I came to separately. I hadn't heard you speak about it, but in a float tank, I kind of thought about this relationship between instinct, intuition, and intellect, kind of like a bottom-up phenomena. If you think about instinct from the basal primal drivers of the body, and the intuition more of like the heart space, and the intellect more of the mind, and sort of this but it didn't stop there for me. Like I thought of like it going all the way up to say the crown and the connection to spirit, and inspiration being this sort of north star, or this thing that you're fired up. It's like your deeper desire, like your ultimate desire. And
Uh-huh.
then intention would be kind of your choice. It would be the rudder or the directionality of your action, you know?
So even there, with the notion of intention, we see this triple. By the way, my phone has 6%, so I'm going to just end up dropping off suddenly, but I'll go as far as I can. And then if
Okay.
I disappear, no, it isn't personal. Um, so the notion here is that if we are looking at intention, that's going to have implications and it's going to give rise to intensity, right? People will have emotional responses to the implications. And in effect, we're trying to suss out what is our intention, what implications does that have, and what intensities are we navigating as a result. Or in the sense that you were speaking of, I want to be able to have a deep sense of my instincts so that through them I can get a better sense of my intuitions without having those intuitions being masked by my instincts any more than my instincts will be masked by my intellect, right? In effect, I want to have it be that, some people in the world will only make choices on the basis of their intellect, or only make choices on the basis of their instinct, or only make choices on the basis of their intuition. And I'm basically saying, no, we need all three.
Mhm.
And we need people to be skillful in all three ways, not to just be reliant on one mode or another. And that we need to be able to navigate between these three modes fluidly for the severity of the choices that we're needing to come up against. That in effect, we need to be at very excellent levels of skill. We need a kind of mastery of our own connection to ourselves at a profound level, our connection to each other at a profound level, and our connection to the world at a profound level, in a way that's not surface level, not egoic, not driven by surface level concerns, but profoundly aware of the well-being of the world, profoundly aware of the well-being of others, and profoundly aware of what is health for oneself at all levels, including the spiritual. And that in this sense, we notice this again, there's a sort of pattern that no amount of intellect is going to teach you about instinct. To become embodied and to learn about one's natural process informs one's biases that affect your intellect, and you need to account for that. And you can't get to intuition unless you have accepted your body. That's called, if you don't accept your body to get to intuition, that's called spiritual bypassing. The intuition that you're getting won't be actionable. It won't be connectable to things that are actually truly here and now. And so in this sense, your intuition is helping you to feel the truth of this. And now we're starting to be able to connect the intellectual construct with the instinct, the actual biological realities, and the intuition, so that all three of them are working together.
And that's when it seems like, deeper truths would be all of it. It would be, rationalized and felt. And so acting from that basis would be something like inspired action, or having the
Yeah.
synthesis of the operating system, flowing on all cylinders, right? Like firing on all
Right.
cylinders. And yeah, and then you take that to the next level.
People need to understand their emotions. Yeah, they need to understand their emotions. They need to understand themselves well enough. That's why early spiritual traditions talk about know thyself, because through that you can know the world and you can know other people.
Yeah. So there's this as above, so below relationship, right? Because if you come into coherence, we'll just call it like coherence on the level of the self, of the individual, you're accepting of the body, right? Like you're letting the languages of instinct, intuition, and intellect all emerge into some sort of inspired action. But then you have to live and exist in an environment of others. And that's where you're talking about balancing the relationship to self and the relationship to other and the relationship to environment. So we can't balance the relationship to environment without balancing relationship to other, and we can't balance
And
relationship to other
yourself.
until we're balanced in ourself, right?
Right. All three. And if there's doubt about one, you use the other two to strengthen the third,
Mm.
whichever way it is. And I'm gonna need to close here really soon because this phone's gonna die soon. But what I would love to just sort of give rise to is that, again, you're thinking about a family, and you won't be in a family context. Like as soon as your child is born, you're going to basically start to be required to think about community issues, other children of the same age, schooling, fire department, police department, all the kind of stuff that we normally take as trappings of Western civilization. But now you're going to be like, how can I find help at a community level to hold as a context with which my family can thrive? And my family thriving will help other families to thrive. So now I need to think at a community level. So where does all of this balance between humanity, technology, and nature happen? Or conscious sustainable evolution happen? It happens in the dynamic of healthy communities, because that's where the choices are going to be made. And in this particular sense, learning the skills of how to balance connection to deep self, connection to deep world, and connection to deep other is going to be upheld in the practice of community process. because it's all those three again, right? Community's got to navigate a world relationship. It's got to navigate a sort of sense of who are we together, and it's got to navigate a sense of the social process that we have together, first, second, and third person. And so in this particular sense, we're noticing actually that this progression from first person to third person through second person back to first person is crucial for us to be in the right flow. Most people are out of sequence. They're doing it in the wrong order. And so as a result, it doesn't work so well. So in effect, we're now needing to become aware of how do we hold community, given that we focus so much on how we hold individuals, right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness at an individual level doesn't equate to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness at a community level. They support one another, but they're not the same.
Mm.
And so in effect, we need to get skillful at life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness at a community level. And to do that, we need to get really good at how we communicate with each other. What are the relational processes? What are the agreements? And underneath all of that, what are the communication dynamics? So we need to get skillful of how we communicate. And now you're back to today you're getting married. That's a communication between you and your partner and you together and the community. And it's a series of commitments, again, communicative acts about how to relate the actual and the potential.
So since I only have a couple seconds or minutes left of your time, what would you say to, as I'm walking into this next chapter, as I'm in the process of finalizing the design and going through the ceremonial process of the marriage, the wedding, how can we bring those communication dynamics into that ceremony? Or do you have any words you might offer to, like, what is marriage, what is sacred union, what is love, and how do we embody that in a way that's not transactional?
Love is that which enables choice. That's just a thing. Learn the dynamics of emotion. Love is always stronger than fear. So if you're feeling fear or anger, unwind it to get back to what you care about and choose from that basis. Okay. Another thing, clear communication supports real relationships, supports authentic agreements. So start with clarity and communication. Make sure that the communication is one that involves all of thought, feeling, and emotion. What you're seeing, what you're feeling, and where your cares are. Emotion is driven by care. Love and care are being kind of treated similarly here. So in this sense, we're wanting to become skillful at how we hold care, which means we need to know about emotions, thoughts, and feelings. It's sometimes helpful to emphasize the feeling aspect and orienting from a feeling aspect. Things like meditation can be helpful, but clear communication practices that involve all of yourself in a accepting, authentic way is crucial. You want to create belongingness for each other. So that basically means my authentic self is accepted by the other in a continuing way. And to do that, I have to create that for them too. So that their authentic self is accepted by me in a continuing way. That's how I create belongingness for my partner and belongingness for the child. So it's not just about creating safety for the child. It's also about creating belongingness and dignity for the child. And to do that, you have to be skillful at holding those for each other. So it's usually the case that men focus on safety issues and women focus on belongingness issues. But, honestly, both of you need to provide all three to each other: belongingness, dignity, and safety. And those are going to be the keys that hold relationships together, focusing on the care that's underneath all of the emotions, and focusing on clear communication and developing skills around that will create a healthy family more so than essentially all of the trappings of whatever work you might be doing.
Yeah. The challenge here that I'm seeing is that just like how we're trying to shift into some sort of regenerative culture, or like the regenaissance or something, to deal with the extractive dynamics and the race to the bottom dynamics that we've talked about, that you've done I think I might have lost you. Oh, you're still just taking video off. Okay, cool. So basically, with the trick I see here is the same dynamics played out inside of marriage, the institution of marriage, or the institution of just not the institution, but in relationships in general. We've had a hollowing out of relationality and of our humanity, right? And that's a byproduct of Western technology, culture, human society that we've sort of been talking about, and the unsustainable aspects of it. So I see, like, going into a wedding ceremony as an opportunity and a necessity of doing a bit of regenerative work in the level of how do we actually come into right relationship inside of this container, and do it in a way that's not just another contract bond transaction. And as I finished that thought, Forrest disconnected. So, um, yeah, if you made it this far, and we're about an hour in, um, what a ride. Forrest has a tremendous mind, and you just constructed like an incredible map. I didn't even want to interrupt him. Like I had a few questions along the ride there, along the nature of like the geometry of the triple in general. I'm curious about that and the nature of sort of this holy trinity dynamic that's playing out in all of these triples that he references in his work. Um, Questions about conscious evolution. I don't know if you guys thought this, but like for me, I'm thinking about if before humanity, before sort of like consciousness in the sense of, so I see there are two possibilities. One is like there's consciousness everywhere and it's not specific to humans. And conscious sustainable evolution is a triple that's been going on for a long time, forever. And in a sense, there's been choice involved from the beginning. Or there's some aspect of evolution that's sort of free of the need for consciousness. Or in other words, there's been sustainable evolution for billions of years. And if you just zoom out in a longer time horizon, then everything seems more sustainable, right? Everything's gonna keep going, and the cycle of life, of birth and death, of life and death, just continues to churn. So that's an interesting. I wanted to get his thoughts on that. Um, I'm just spitballing my questions at nobody right now because I have them in my head and I might as well record them for later. But vision first is another question. Like, so he's talking about culture first in this culture, vision, and strategy triple, and the sequencing being that culture comes first. But I I'm curious because it's like it seems like what we're trying to do is emerge new culture, and culture is trying to evolve, and we need sort of the evolution of culture towards something more regenerative and towards a more beautiful world, because our current culture is sort of like stuck in this race to the bottom dynamic. Um, so how do you shift the culture in order to be aligned with the right kind of vision or a conscious sustainable evolution vision, right? Because he's talking about that as the North Star or the vision. So, how do you not start with vision and then use that to shift culture? And then culture can sort of source the strategy or something like that. I don't know. I do see his point about the slippery slope of the tech startup bro or whatever, just with the strategy vision and then just pushing their agenda and making that work and then adapting the culture to fit that. And I do see a value in sourcing the vision and the strategy from the collective, from the culture. But how do you get that started without a vision, right? Or without a strategy? So that's the sort of double bind I'm in, because it's like I see this podcast, this project, True North Project, as a way to start to sort of orient and find that vision, find that North Star worth orienting to. And then from there, how do we get the culture around that project? How do we open source it? How do we decentralize it? How do we get the right strategy to then start implementing change and orient and actually planting the seeds for the more beautiful world? So that's an interesting sort of question that I think you'd have a good answer to. And then there's obviously this essential theme that I hope you guys were all picking up on, which is that throughout this whole, and by the way, I would have like tried to scaffold this better throughout the conversation, but I just wanted to like let him riff. He had a lot to say, which was wonderful. But this underlying dynamic of mastery of choice, both on the individual level and then on the collective level, mastering choice is like he said, the problem of our time or the task of our time. It's the fundamental thing we have to figure out, because we've, with mastery of causal process or causation and technology and AI and nukes and, everything that we have and that we're, racing towards, without the mastery of choice, that seems to be a system that self-terminates. That seems to eventually go really bad, right? And if not just for us, really bad for all of life on Earth. So mastering choice seems to be the ticket, and I would highly recommend that you guys check out. And it's backwards, you can read it, but it's called The Effective Choice by Forrest Landry, and it's the most accessible little book I think, that is, if you want Forrest's work, if you want to dive into it, it's a lot more accessible than say reading Immanent Metaphysics, which is something I'm gonna try to dive into next because I want to get to the root of this um, sort of philosophy and structure of this trinity, of this triple, and the underlying metaphysics that he's pulling from in describing all of this. I want to really understand it all the way down at the bottom of the stack. So I'm going to do the legwork of getting through imminent metaphysics and then have him back on the podcast. So hopefully I'm sure that will be fruitful. But if you're curious and you want to go deeper with Forrest's work and you want to sort of have a good entry point, it's called The Effective Choice. Check out magicflight.com. He has a company called Magic Flight, and I'll put a link to it I'll put a link to The Effective Choice in the show notes, actually. So let's do that. And if you're in St. George, if you're in Southern Utah, swing by True North Float. We have a bunch of copies of them there. I stocked up a whole box of these books because I think of it as kind of like um, essential. Like Forrest is saying, mastery of choice is essential. It's like at this point, there's not an option to figure out. Like it's not optional. It's like this is sort of the obstacle is the way kind of idea. Like we're hitting the limits to growth, planetary boundaries, existential risk kind of off the charts, arms race dynamics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that we've talked about. And I've had, previous conversations with Forrest about if you want to go back and listen to our conversations about Moloch, and that was back in I don't know, episode 33 or something. So yeah, check out those if you want. I went out to meet Forrest and we actually had a 3-part conversation. So definitely, definitely worth looking into that if this has piqued your curiosity and you want to know more. But I see mastery of choice being a fundamental kind of phase shift that humanity has to make. And we have to kind of go from these caterpillars that are decimating their environment, eating all of the resources, extracting all of the value, and kind of making a mess, shitting the bed, so to speak, which might work for a while, right? But over a long enough time horizon, that's a, collapse. And that has to, so in other words, there's going to be a balancing that's going to happen, and it's either going to be that the population collapse happens, or the whole meta crisis thing kind of breaks everything, or there's a phase shift and it's more like a metamorphosis, and we're going into butterfly, and we're essentially going to be the pollinators of the planet, right? Like the stewards and the gardeners of earth. And I think mastery of choice, both on like making effective choices as an individual, but then doing, as Forrest was talking about, meeting others in this sort of coherence where your instinct, intuition, and intellect are all aligned, and you are operating in this sort of place of coherence as a more holistic person, and as a balanced person. And then from that dynamic, having the right social dynamics and incentives to then create collective effective choice, where we can then start to uh, have a collective conversation around, say, what is conscious sustainable evolution, and how would we orient our families, our communities, our nations, our species in that way? How can we all be in a unified how can we all as a planet have the same North Star? And that sounds like a weird thing to ask, because it's like, well, that'll never happen. I mean, everyone believes in a different version of God, and everyone's, there's all these different flags and borders and militaries and et cetera. But from the perspective of life, it doesn't even have to be a species specific thing. Conscious sustainable evolution is a great North Star in the sense that it's valuing implicitly life itself, and also still affording life to change and for evolution to occur. There's a lot of questions I still have around this, like, isn't it just evolution if we go extinct, right? And the next thing emerges, right? Even if that's machines or artificial intelligence, whatever. But, I know Forrest would disagree with that. And he's got many arguments as to why, replacing biological life with artificial life would be a horrific loss and a cost that you'd never want to pay. And I think I agree with him. And we were having a conversation yesterday on a Flow Genome project call, community call, which, by the way, uh, I'm going to try to get Jamie Will on this podcast, but if you haven't heard of Flow Genome yet, check out Flow Genome Project. Definitely worth looking into. But we're having a community call about this exact topic of is 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 life, is biological life inherently precious? Is carbon-based life inherently precious, or is it ultimately just going to get replaced by silicon-based life and artificial intelligence and machines? Um, and and also on another level, like with humanity and becoming a spacefaring civilization, uh, is there something special about Earth, or should we be colonizing, right? Should we be out expanding into the cosmos? And seems like the underlying tones from that community and from our conversations were along the lines of like, hey, we shouldn't be going anywhere until we get shit dialed in on Earth, right? For a couple of reasons. One is like, why spread a plague, right? Like, why spread the flood across the galaxy? Why spread uh, non-sustainable evolution? In other words, why be the emperor just colonizing the rest of the galaxy and spreading war and subjugation and suffering? Like that doesn't seem like the most interesting thing we could do. Uh, and then on the other level, it's like from just a very strategic point of view, tactical point of view, seems like a bad plan to try to colonize other planets if your home base is falling apart. And also seems like it's not going to work, right? It's going to take thousands of trips to Mars before Mars can exist on its own. In the sense that we'd have to terraform that planet, and that's going to take generations of human life. Generations of human life, and just then in my generation, Earth is going to be in a fucking shit show if we don't change things now, right? So, like, there's a very immediate need for a shift to happen at this stage of the game. Even if we do want to colonize, or colonize is the wrong word, but if we want to expand into other areas of space. And honestly, if we do get things dialed in on Earth and we hit some sort of equilibrium as pollinators as butterflies on the planet, as stewards and gardeners of this planet, of this beautiful fucking precious jewel, then why would we want to leave? And what if that's actually a weird idea? What if the exploration is within? And what if the real frontier is consciousness, and the frontier isn't out there in the empty, vast expanse of the vacuum of space where it's inhospitable, and where we didn't evolve on any of those planets that we're headed towards, you know what I mean? So like, but this is our home. This is where we evolve. This is where we belong. And what if here, once we get things like dialed, then dialed, just meaning like conscious sustainable evolution, we don't blow ourselves up, we don't, run off the cliff, then maybe things get more and more interesting as our capacity for exploration still expands, but it's expanding in different ways that are, something more like a spiritual direction or something like that. So, a couple, well, I mentioned this as he was dropping off, but like, I see obviously what's on my mind and my heart right now is, well, marriage and my partner. And this idea of monogamy has been really tough for me for a long time. Um, because not because of anything against monogamy, but because of the baggage that comes along with our culture. So, I grew up in a non-monogamous, polygamous society of fundamentalist Mormons. So the idea of monogamy was actually the weird thing, strangely enough, from where I grew up. And I saw as I left Mormonism at 20, I started to see the real issues with the culture that I was a part of in terms of the relationality between people, primarily a hierarchical relationship between man over woman. And I know there's all kinds of like Mormon justifications for this, like, well, the man's subjective to Jesus or to God or something, and there's everything's in the proper order of things and all that. But at the end of the day, it's like, hey, if women are silenced, if women aren't in their power, if women aren't creative, if women are subdued, then something's off, something's wrong. And you don't have to look very hard to see that that's the case. So I saw that that was the case. And I don't want anything like that in my dynamic as someone who's going into a marriage. It's like I don't want to have power over. I want to trust my power, be fully in my power as a man, but that power should be in service, both to what I love, my family, my wife, my children, my community, and also something greater, like being in service to some higher power. And then the flip side of this is the sort of the general or more mainstream monogamist culture, which seems to have this same dynamic. That's what I was pointing to right when Forrest dropped off the call, which was that there's this sort of hollowing out of the value of our society has sort of created this. I mean, there's a meaning crisis, right? So the meaning crisis, I would say, is some sort of byproduct or emergent phenomenon of this dynamic where we've reduced value to metrics like money, right? And this has caused a hollowing out of real value. So, for example, if a forest can only be measured in value by what the lumber is worth, then you cut down the forest because it's only valuable if you sell the trees for lumber. And then you lose the inherent value and the actual value of the forest, which is a fucking forest. Like it's not valuable as, I mean, the what I can do with timber or lumber is trivial compared to the value of a forest. So like a full ecology of life and relationship and interbeingness of creation and beauty, like so in the same way, when we reduce human relationality to contract or transactionality, like a transaction, a sort of agreement, um, then I think a lot of the value is lost, right? And so this would be the difference between like, I mean, I guess trust is the simplest way to put it, right? Like if you have a relationship where you don't, you know, say cheat on your wife, but just because if you do, she'll divorce you and she'll take half of your net worth, then what you really have is just like a fucking uh a, ten, a this sort of hollow thing that's kind of empty in some level. But if you don't cheat on your wife because there's trust and you value that trust more than you value, say, a novelty experience or, chasing, some sort of, you know, whatever, like fleeing or, short-term thrill, like that trust is actually the power. The trust is um, where it's the basis or the foundation by which true value can really emerge, I think. So, yeah. Anyways, you just now getting an insight into more of what I wanted to talk to Forrest about, and I will definitely have him back on this pod to go deeper into this relationship of the Trinity and the structure of these triples, and then to talk more, hopefully, about how can we start taking steps towards conscious, sustainable evolution in a more practical way than, I mean, he's done a fantastic job of like laying out this map. And, I believe the argument resonates with me, and I won't even call it an argument, but like the vision of all this seems like a very sound and resonant one. But I also am thinking now very practically as I'm stepping into this next chapter of my life, which is like he said, it becomes very much like, okay, now where do my kids grow up? How are they in community and relationship? How do we do this thing right? How do we plant these seeds for the more beautiful world? And if you are, if you have kids, if you're planning on having kids, or if you're just a young person in general, um, these are questions that you're probably thinking about. It's probably why you're listening now if you are. It's like this is the fucking jam. And the boomers are dying. The earth is I don't want to say dying as well, but like it's hurting. And there is a hopefully metamorphosis happening. And if my life, my own, there's this kind of hermetic law of as above, so below. And it's called the law of correspondence. So it's like if my inner experience is of any indication, which according to Hermeticism it is, it's saying like what's happening in you is happening out there, right? Like there's this inside outside relationality in this as above, so below thing. So if that's the case, then my life would be an indicator that we're going through some sort of metamorphosis collectively, because that's been the story of my life. The story of my life has been like waking up with kind of a whimper to the state of humanity and the planet, and sort of the path that we're on, or the North Star that we're oriented to, namely Moloch or Mammon or whatever you want to call it, but like these sort of profane gods of like the coordination failure and the race to the bottom dynamic that we're in, where, you know, even though every human being needs clean air and water, we're fucking those things up pretty fast. And even though we all seek belonging and human connection, we've kind of lost that. We fucked that up quite a bit, and we've created this alienated sort of culture of separation and loneliness and suicide and mass shootings and etc. So yeah, wake up with a whimper. It's like fuck. You go, you know, as Mark Gaffney and Zach Stein say, you start out in the pre-tragic, where you're like kind of in the Shire, and you don't really realize the bigger picture. And then as you sort of begin to kind of hit the hard edges of the world, and it kind of forces you awake, and then you start to shift into the tragic. And this is another triple: pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic. And so in the tragic, which I feel like I spent, you know, my 20s there, and now I'd like to think that I'm taking steps into post-tragic, and that's why I'm making these decisions to get married and start a family, because there's well, the only way out is through. And despite the shit show, the horror, the grief, the tragedy, despite that, um, life is beautiful, and there's a beautiful soul waiting for me to say yes. And that's what I'm going to go do. So, ciao.